I think
Right.
when Tesla starts rolling out robotaxis, the first place is going to be somewhere in California. They'll get approval, they'll do a few rides, and the end will be, oh, who cares? That was like 3 robotaxi rides. And the models will be like 2030, Tesla's going to have 50,000 robotaxis on Earth. And the actual number is probably going to be order of magnitude plus beyond that.
Hey, y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I am with Stephen Mark Ryan from Solving the Money Problem. You may have heard of this guy before. He just happens to be one of the major channels for Tesla bulls and for just generally, I don't know, fighting the good fight. Is that what you would say about yourself these days?
I guess so. Great to be
All right.
here.
I'm really happy to be able to talk to you. I think we're just going to have a talk. I actually don't want to start with Tesla because you talk about Tesla all the time. So I want to start with more like, yeah, you do. So I was like, I'm going to
Literally,
catch you and
yeah.
we're going to talk about some other stuff. So anyway,
Cool.
I kind of wanted to talk about Sora. DeepMind just dropped Genie today. I'm not even sure if you've seen that, but it's a game playing
Not
AI.
yet, no.
Yeah, it's
No.
crazy. ChatGPT, Grok, Gemini, which is having its own issues these, yeah. So anyway, let's just start with the lie of the land in terms of AGI, because clearly Tesla is one of the players in that field, but I'm just curious what your take on all that is.
Well, I think what we're seeing in the last probably 18 or so months now is evidence that progress in AI seems to come out of nowhere. And then we have a hockey stick moment in capabilities where it goes from absolute trash to pretty impressive, but obviously still laughable to holy crap, this is as good as humans.
Right.
And so I think this is giving some people finally an insight, people who are very skeptical of when AGI is likely, oh, that's the end of the century. Hang on a minute. If we have more of these moments where there's a breakthrough in capabilities, we've seen this with stable diffusion with image generation. A couple of years ago, pretty cool demonstrations, but it looked like pretty potato quality output and just
Right.
it's like it was hallucinating. And now suddenly we have incredible ability to generate art, beautiful, and not just abstract art, but also photorealistic imagery. And then more recently with Sora, we can now essentially do the same text prompt to image and then to video. So essentially, this is just 30 frames a second of image, but it's coherent and consistent. And so I don't know how far we are away from being able to prompt an entire episode of your favorite, let's say Star Trek, right? I know you're a bit
Right.
of a nerd. Imagine a next generation episode. Like, here's my favorite next generation Star Trek episodes. Can you please make a new episode based on my favorites being these 10? And
Right.
I don't think we're that far away from stuff like this. And I think now people are able to start mapping, well, hang on, if this is happening with image generation and now video, like what other capabilities are going to seemingly come out of nowhere? And I
Right.
think that the pieces of the puzzle are really starting to fall together now, whereas prior to now, you hear somebody like Ray Kurzweil talk about AGI and these kind of things, like, oh, that guy's crazy. What's he talking about? And now it's like, well, it may actually happen a little bit quicker than people expect. So
Yeah. Okay.
there's now proof that these breakthroughs and this rate of progress can and does happen, as opposed to it being speculative.
Yeah. And this was one of those things. I have a friend who, and actually, I think he was basing it on, oh gosh, who wrote 2001? Arthur C. Clarke. He said 50 years after people stop laughing, the space elevator will be built. But he's saying, 5 years after people stop laughing about AGI, we're going to have
Hmm.
AGI. And it's like, well, yeah, we've,
Yeah.
we've stopped laughing about it. Even a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
people were like, you're an idiot.
Yep.
So,
Yep. It's been
and
quite interesting. Yeah.
yeah, I think one of the things that kind of amazes me is I feel like I'm kind of an abject optimist. And so I'm always overestimating, but lately I have been way underestimating this stuff. If you'd asked me when I was
Mhm.
like in 1985 or something, like, when are we going to get AGI? I would have been like 1995, I would have been like all over that
Mhm.
stuff. And
Yeah.
now I'm like 2030, but I'm like, holy crap, no, no, no. It's probably going to happen next year. I think 2025, 2026, we're looking at that.
Yeah. There's some fascinating research that ARK Invest published in their big ideas. It was a great slide showing expert forecast for when AGI happens, just the average consensus estimate. And about over the last 5 or 6 years, the estimate has fallen by an order of magnitude. Now, you would expect that it should have fallen by 5 years if the estimates were accurate. If 5 years ago people were accurately guessing, but now that we've seen enough breakthroughs, suddenly people who are previously thinking it's 2050, 2075 are like 2030 or sooner. And if
Right.
that era of forecasting continues, it's currently on track, the consensus around 2030. But if the forecasting error is still there, I mean, bro, it's going to be wild to look back a few years or a decade or so from now and see what's around the corner and what's actually happened.
Yeah, that's actually one of my questions is we'll wait on that for a little bit, but to put on your prognosticator hat and say, what is the world going to look like in 2030? Because even a year ago, I would have said, it's going to look pretty much the same as today. But now I do not believe that anymore. I think we're looking at something fundamentally different, and it's really cool and also terrifying. Okay, well, cool. So let's wrap this back to Tesla a little bit, because regardless of what some people on Wall Street say, clearly Tesla is an AI play at this point. That's honestly, I think that's probably,
Really? I thought they were just a car company.
well, they're just a car company.
What? Wait, this is news to me. Hang on. Oh, I'm going to sell all my Nicholas stock. And
We'll just go ahead and do an AG1 ad now. So we'll close out.
yeah, I guess I forgot my AG1 this morning.
So but yeah, I mean, I think that the two big secrets they have is their incredible manufacturing capability and their AI, which is also helping them to manufacture vehicles at high rates of speed. But I think more fun to talk about than that, not as, I mean, it's just as important to what they're doing in the factory, but full self-driving and of course Optimus. Like, what do you foresee? What, I think, are you still sticking by the end of 2024? I think that's what you said for the first robotaxi
That was
ride.
my original prediction when I first posted my valuation model in 2021, a few years ago now. I was expecting the first robotaxi legally allowed to operate somewhere, presumably in California, late 2024. I've since differentiated between my bull case and my bear case and my base case. That was always the intent. You know, the valuation model is a consistent work in progress, and I've had that caveat. So that is my bull case now. My base case is bumped out a year. My bear case is bumped out 2 years. So I still think it's reasonably possible. The problem is now we're in that zone just before the hockey stick moment, where a year ago, if you said, can you prompt text to video that's going to be compelling? I'll be like, oh, well, I mean, it'll happen at some point, but I don't know exactly when. So it will happen at some point, I believe, and it's seemingly going to come out of nowhere. And I think the major bottleneck now for Tesla is actually training compute. They've got plenty of high quality data. And we can see what happens now when you get enough compute up and running, you've got decent data, you can actually build a model almost out of nowhere in the span of less than 12 months and go, bam, superhuman capability. So, I mean, that's the best I could do is predict. And I don't know exactly when it takes place. My best guess is probably somewhere on the order of 12 to 24, worst case, 36 months. But it's not like a linear progression where I'm like, oh, yeah, okay, here we are, we're nearly there. It's like, we're on the cusp of that hockey stick, but where does that hockey stick moment take place?
Right.
And that's really going to be, I think, dependent on training compute. And then if Tesla discovers there's any other issues that they need to resolve or a new approach or little tweaks. But it seems to me now that they're doing end-to-end training on video, there's no more bottlenecks. Whereas prior to that, there were a lot of unknowns. The heuristics are out the window now, and we're seeing behavior like a human driver being trained on good human driving. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a very long way of saying I don't know, but I think it's going to be sooner than most people think. And the most important thing to mention is from a Tesla investor's point of view, I don't care when it happens. What I care is, does Tesla solve it? Do they have a lead? Is that lead unassailable in terms of data? Will they be able to scale widely, rapidly versus everyone else? This is more of a relative point than absolute. I don't see anyone else even close to being in a position to do what Tesla's done so far, nor to catch them. And I think this is very important, because the timing, it's irrelevant whether it's 24, 25, 26. That doesn't matter as much as how long would it take another company to accumulate sufficient data and enough training compute to replicate what Tesla's done? And the answer to that is too long.
Right. Yeah, I'll agree with that. I think another data point that I've found really, really intriguing, and it's just in the last couple of weeks as we've started to see Sora in particular, and then Genie today. And I actually just posted this on X. I said, anyway, Sora first. The title of the paper is, building world models. It's not making cool videos. And that means that we've got another company coming at this from a whole different angle, arriving at the same conclusion, which is give this thing a whole bunch of damn video, and out pops a world model and understanding of three-dimensional space. And now we're seeing this thing, Genie, from DeepMind, and I know you haven't seen it yet, but basically it constructs, they gave it a whole bunch of 2D side-scrolling video games. And it now not only understands those worlds, but it can actually, press the virtual joystick buttons, the A, B, X, Y, whatever those buttons are on your SNES system, the old school guys. But so that means that it's like an agent that's actually operating in a world that it's constructing as it's going. And it's just amazing to watch. It can like go different direct. Anyway, those two things together make me feel like Tesla has to be on the right track. because they're all doing the same thing from very different angles. They're coming at it from
Yep.
different ways, but they're taking video. And then Tesla has got, in terms of driving, like you said, an unassailable lead, because not lead. They don't just have one video angle, right? You're not looking at this thing with one eye and trying to figure out the world. You've got 8 eyes. And so you can really figure things out. And you've got an IMU, which tells you how the jerk and acceleration and everything is working. And then beyond that, let's say that NVIDIA, I think NVIDIA, I'm like, holy crap, they might actually be able to do this too, but they can't push out 5 million vehicles next year, whereas Tesla can do that. That's a huge, huge advantage that Tesla has.
Yeah, it's important for people to really think about this, because core to my thesis is, how would another company catch up to and exceed Tesla on FSD?
Right.
There's a lot of people that just have this dismissive, well, people can catch up, like, duh, anyone can catch anything. But you have to think, how would you do that? And in order to do that, you need to somehow equal Tesla's current amount of data, roughly, and then exceed or match their data collection rate in the future. And so, I mean, there'll probably come a point in the distant future where you won't need nearly as much data. Once you've got efficient, once you've got enough decent models and enough data, you don't need infinite data. But until we get to that point, you would need to build out a fleet of, call it 5 million vehicles covered in sensors instantly. How? And like, literally, how do you do that? Do you pay an automotive company to cover their vehicles in sensors and spend billions of dollars to put your sensors on other vehicles? And who's going to agree? What boards are going to approve that? Especially if you're a legacy automotive company. Alternatively, you could scale your own company and build your own vehicles at a faster rate than Tesla. And good luck with that, bro. And so you really do have to think, how would a company gather that amount of data? And realistically, I just don't think that's, in this version of the simulation, I don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We could Monte Carlo it out and see where we go. But yeah. I think, I mean, also the other piece of that puzzle is that, let's assume that Tesla solves it in 2020X, whatever year that is. Then they can go like, hey, for $1,000 plus the cost of hardware, we'll license this to you. And so why would you spend $5 billion to try to catch what you can't catch instead of just spending bucks?
Exactly. And this is also an important point, and part of that thinking process of, if you can't catch Tesla, or not reasonably, what's the alternative? Tesla's already said they're open to licensing FSD. And as a company that wants to offer a similar product, you'd have to have rocks on your head to try and do the impossible and spend billions of dollars doing so, and possibly bankrupt yourself, to almost inevitably bankrupt yourself in the process, when you could just go, yo, Elon, can we get what everyone else is getting and license that FSD, bro? Because in essence, for the people who aren't super technical, all that Tesla really needs to do is for their engineers to do a little bit of code on camera placement, and suddenly that same software can operate on other vehicles. So it's a very simple process to actually get other vehicles operating Tesla FSD, assuming they're willing to put the right sensors on the vehicle to actually run the software in the first place. And this is important. That's going to be a much simpler process. And if these companies are on the edge of going bankrupt and they need to have autonomy as a means of surviving, I think Tesla's going to offer a very, very generous revenue split. Well, I don't know what it would be, but let's just say it was 50-50, where the company, Ford or whoever, is actually getting 50% of the software profit themselves, and Tesla's taking the other half. It's a no-brainer, because Ford suddenly is now making a few $1,000s per vehicle on this software, yet Tesla's also making a few thousand. Everybody wins. And that's also in Tesla's best interest, because it's going to put more vehicles on roads that are capable of doing more miles as potentially robo-taxis, which is in line with their mission. This seems like the most likely outcome. And back to my Tesla valuation model, FSD licensing has been in that from day one as well. It seemed obvious that this was the end scenario.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Did you catch Gary Black's? I think it was either last night or this morning. He or whatever time it was your time, but he pointed out that he was basically saying, we can't evaluate Tesla's AI play because we don't have enough information. They're not spoon feeding us this information. And my response was, well, CERN Basher actually responded first and said, hey, you can just come up with these numbers and say, this is what it's going to be. But then I ripped off that and I was like, yeah. So basically you can create a Monte Carlo simulation with a Gaussian spread of probabilities and how much money this would all be. And you can model that out. And that seems reasonable. So this goes back to, like,
agree.
You're railing on these guys for like, hey, they don't have to do all your work for you. You can actually do some homework yourself.
Yeah, well, my valuation model is essentially a very watered down Monte Carlo. I've got 4 different scenarios with different probabilities and different weights, and I weight those averages. It's a very simplified version of the same model. It's a distribution of probabilities. Now, obviously, you have to guess the probabilities, But I think the Wall Street way is, well, until it's slapped me in the face, I just ignore it. And I understand they don't want to be wrong because there's incentives where if you're wrong about something taking place, everyone points and laughs and goes, you're an idiot. But if you're wrong because you missed an opportunity, you will just chase after it with your stock price target and massively increase your earnings estimates overnight, and no one says anything.
Yeah.
Like, so the incentives are not sort of designed in such a way that most analysts and most folks on Wall Street are incentivized to have a pair of balls. Courage is not rewarded. It's actually punished. If you're saying that Tesla's likely to solve autonomy in 20, and you start saying this in 5 years ago, they'll solve it by 2020. Next minute, people are digging up an old clip of you saying in 2020 Tesla probably solves autonomy, and suddenly your estimate for the valuation is 3 times what the company's currently trading at. People are like, you're a moron, you don't know what you're talking about. As opposed to the analysts who said nothing, and then suddenly it does get solved. Next minute, they triple their price target overnight because, suddenly the earnings are through the roof. No one says anything. So the incentives really aren't aligned for courage on Wall Street, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Perverse incentives are definitely, I mean, if you make that kind of prediction and you blow $1 billion worth of your customers' money, you get fired probably, and probably lawsuits after you too. Whereas if you don't say anything and you just chase it after it happens, then you've missed out on this giant opportunity, but you're safe. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's unfortunate. I guess it leaves it to people like us who are willing to, again, for folks who don't know, not financial advice, never financial advice on this channel. But anyway, but we can be a little bit more reasonable about thinking about these things. And I'm sure that, Wall Street's full of very, very intelligent people. So I'm sure at least privately they can model this stuff out. They're just too scared to say it publicly.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of the folks on Wall Street would run circles around, and most of the retail investors in Tesla, but there is the concern about them being wrong to the downside and just lacking courage. I mean, a lot of retail investors like to mock the Wall Street analysts as being idiots. They're dumb geniuses in this context, in my opinion. And I'm sure privately a lot of them suspect certain things are going to happen, but they don't have the courage to actually go out on a limb because there's too much uncertainty. And as we said, the perverse incentives, they're not rewarded for the courage. There's not analysts back in the day who were pointing out that Amazon was, operating with paper thin margins, not making any profit, but building huge scale and had a lot of things. They would have been laughed out of the room if they had have said what the future of Amazon looked like. The same with Apple. It's not until after the fact where suddenly, oh yeah, Apple's a great play. They've got hardware with high margins, crazy software margins and services. What a great stock. Apple's stock up 50% this year. It's easy and safe now. But to take that leap of courage beforehand, you're very rarely going to see that on Wall Street, unfortunately. And I think most of the people on Wall Street who really, really get it and have confidence usually can't own a stock they cover, so they leave their job. Shout out to somebody like Andrea James, who, goes, you know what, I need to buy this stock as opposed to talk about it. And so, yeah.
But also talk about perverse incentives there too. It's like you're not allowed to own these stocks as a financial analyst.
Yeah,
so then what kind of incentive do you have to care about these things?
Exactly. And if you really, really genuinely believe you've found a massive opportunity, why the hell would you stay in your job making a couple $100,000 a year talking about the stock when you could have put a couple of years of salary into that stock and make decades worth of your income if you're right?
Yeah, it's incentivized to just make people trade. I mean, that's all that is. It's like you watch, because that's how they make their money. They're making on the commissions back and forth. Yeah. So
yeah. Activity
real investing
equals money.
is boring as hell. I mean, I've got stuff I've been sitting on for 25 years. It just sits there. My Apple stock just sits there. So it's like, it's whatever.
Yeah.
So let me ask about Optimus. So is it the same thing as full self-driving? Is it different? A lot of people talk about the total addressable market of this thing being essentially unbounded, except by the laws of physics and how big the universe is. But
yes,
are these von Neumann machines? I mean, are we talking about these are going to be the human emissaries going forth?
I think over a long enough time scale, it just gets so absurd. You really do have to take a step back and go, what even is this? I mean, I've personally said until we start butting up against the laws of physics in terms of energy and matter in our local system, there may not be a reasonable upper limitation to this potential for intelligent humanoid robots. Now, I don't have proof, but history so far has shown that humanity over time becomes more productive and finds ways to use that increased productivity. And we're just trending toward hyperabundance. Maybe there's some hard limit I don't know about where more labor doesn't really help. But I can't see that. But I'm dumbass, I'm not smart enough to understand how How confident I can be in that outcome, I don't know. But my best guess at this point is Earth could probably sustain easily at least a 10x in terms of global labor at this point and utilize that productively in massive ways. We are also, a lot of people, I don't think, will realize or believe that we're going to enter an era of energy hyperabundance where we have more energy than we know what to do with. We're going to overbuild battery capacity. There's going to be solar, wind, hydro, etc. We're going to have so much energy. It's like, what do we do with it? And there's also the added effect of becoming more efficient in using energy. So, and there's going to be a sort of a feedback loop where we have more energy, but now we're more efficient using our energy. What do we do? And I think the possibilities there just get completely ridiculous. You might have to hang out with your friend Lucy or Mary Jane to figure out, what that actually leads to. But I think that most people are just like, this is just too ridiculous to even fathom. So I'll just ignore it or dismiss it. I have modeled Tesla out until late this century. Now, obviously, the rate of uncertainty just gets so absurd. I would never share those estimates publicly, but it's worth doing the exercise. What if Tesla can scale their production to a certain amount, and then maybe they just have a terminal rate of 5% growth per year? It just gets so absolutely ridiculous. And the key question to ask yourself is, do you believe that Tesla or any company can create a form of intelligence in a humanoid form that can add useful labor, not just physical labor, but also intellectual labor? And if so, at some point, surely then it can get to human level and then greater than human level. What happens then? I mean, we've seen what humans have been able to do so far, and we aren't exactly the pinnacle of intelligence, at least in terms of what's possible.
Right.
So, we have meat computers, right? We're pretty slow and clunky relative to what's possible. So you think about that, and the sky's maybe not even the limit. It just gets ridiculous. And this is why I think it's very important for investors to at least think about the future, the distant future, and what are the possible outcomes, as opposed to just going, oh, that's ridiculous, I'm not even going to think about that.
Yeah. I think, the Chome from Frank Herbert's Dune series is not unreasonable at some point. Whether that's Tesla or not, I don't know, but I like the funding secured glass. That's great. Good mug. But it is kind of hard to imagine the kind of scale we could be talking about. So when you say 10x, we've got 8 billion humans on the planet right now. Are you talking about 80 billion robots before we need to start getting them off the planet?
Yeah, I don't think that's probably the upper limit, but just as a really sort of lowball point of reference, I can easily see a 10x in terms of humanoid robots / people. So call it 100 billion, just round up.
Yeah.
I don't see really any major issues there. Most people today do it a 40-hour work week,
Right.
Let's just round really simply. Roughly half the people on Earth are contributing labor in some form or another. There's a lot of kids, there's retirees, but just roughly half. There's huge capacity to get more done. If, for example, Tesla had today 100 million humanoid robots, they would already have an $18,000 electric vehicle. That was because they would have scaled to a point they'd be producing them fast enough and cheap enough. And suddenly they'd be replacing those 2 billion vehicles on roads in a matter of years, as opposed to over a few decades. So there's a huge acceleration of projects that humanity could be working on and is working on that could take place a lot faster if we had more labor. And every time we find we have a huge breakthrough with technology that makes us more efficient, suddenly we find new ways to use that labor. If you had to explain to somebody, 80 years ago what the internet would do, they would have laughed and go, what are you talking about? Right. None of this would have seemed possible. And the huge economic implications that we've had, I think that humanoid robots are going to be like that, but, multiplied by many orders of magnitude in terms of the impact.
Yeah. I mean, we can look back in history, not that far. I mean, take 1900 and think about where we were in 1900 and what people's lives were like then. And it's just 125 years basically since that point. Unimaginable changes. And that's just with a few billion meat computers with no evolution of our brains. I mean, we're basically the same primates that we were 125 years ago. Yeah. And yet we've managed to do incredible things in 125 years. So if you project that forward 125 years and you 10x the labor force and you have these things that are working that are smarter than humans that can work instead of 40-hour weeks, basically 80-90% of the time of, full, it's kind of unimaginable. You think about like a lab doing pharmaceutical research that's populated by 1 million robots doing like experiments 100% with an AI controlling them, going like, try this.
Yes.
therapy or something. So
Yeah.
what do you think? Yeah, what do you think about? I know you said you want to live basically forever or arbitrarily long until you choose to die. Do you think that's
Yeah.
going to be possible? Do you think it's going to be possible for me? I'm a lot older than you.
Possible, yes, but I mean, I don't know the exact probabilities. But
Yeah.
the way to think about this is pretty simple. Historically, we have a pretty good track record of humans on average living longer over time with developments in technology, medicine, and so on.
Right.
The question is, will there come a point in the future where, on average, medicine, technology is extending the average human lifespan by more than 1 year per year? In essence, once you get to that point, you've reached longevity escape velocity. Now, I don't know when that is, but people underappreciate the exponential increases in technology and what that is going to do in terms of medicine, genomics, the ability to regenerate at the cellular level, also the possibilities of nanobots. I mean, even a 1-to-1 ratio of nanobot to cell in a human body is not out of the question eventually.
Right.
And so I think that people are going to be surprised by the advancements that happen in the next few decades. My goal at this point is to keep my body in good enough condition that should there be any advancements I can take advantage of,
Right.
I'll be all over them. And a lot of people have this misconception, I wouldn't want to live forever. I don't want to be old and frail. Bro, if you're living that long, it's because you're not old and frail. And
Yep.
nobody's suggesting that they want to extend the last couple of months of life and be decrepit, frail, cognitive. Basically, they don't want to be Joe Biden for the next 100 years. But
Yeah.
if you can remain healthy and vital and energetic and well, unless you have crippling depression and just literally don't want to live, why would you not want the option of having
Right.
more life? And I think the only people that would be ready to tap out are either those who've exhausted themselves and ground so hard for their 80 years, they're ready to drop because they can't do any more. They've completely depleted themselves. And some people operate like that. I think Musk is probably one of them.
Yeah.
And the other group of people are folks who just don't have anything to live for, whether or not they've put a lot of work in. They're just like, I'm done. And I'm not one of those people. There's always something that I want to learn or do.
Right.
Spending time with friends and family, acquiring new skills, testing myself. There's so much that I still would like to do that I really think it's an important priority for most people who have a similar mindset to look after their health. You don't need to be perfect, but if you're doing things that are likely to shave decades off your life, and it's possible that if you had just lived another 5 or 10 years, that you would have hit that wave of longevity escape velocity.
Right.
Probably missing the trick.
Yeah, that's important. Yeah, I've gotten this weird sense that I maybe was born 10 years too early. I'm like, damn, it's a big difference.
Yeah.
I've stopped thinking about lifespan entirely because of my father who recently passed away. He just had his health was so bad for the last decade of his life, and I was like, it doesn't matter how long you live at that point. That it's all about how long you're healthy for, not really how
It's
long.
health span, not lifespan.
Yeah,
That's really the focus. Health span. Yep, exactly.
So, but the other thing is, it's not just. Hopefully, at some point they'll stop aging and they'll be able to say stop. But then the really, really golden ticket is if they can start reversing it, and you can pick.
Well,
like, do
we
you
are
want to be
seeing
18,
some evidence
30?
that it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's possible now to slow your rate of aging. I mean, it depends how it's being measured. There's a bunch of different ways of measuring that, but it is possible to slow your rate of aging by a number of different measurements by less than 1 year per year. So it is already possible to slow your rate of aging because it's not how many years in terms of the calendar, but what your body actually says. How degraded is your body, not how many birthdays have you had. And we're also seeing some evidence, especially experimental in non-human species, where we can actually reverse age based on these markers. So it's definitely theoretically possible. And there's a lot of therapies that are around the corner, number of years, maybe a decade at most, that are likely to be able to completely revitalize just about every aspect of the human body. Right. So, and I don't think most people are aware of this. I'm doing a lot of things today in my best efforts without being completely extreme. You still got to live, but to slow my age of my rate of aging as much as possible, and to keep myself in really good condition. And it's not as difficult as most people think. There's really basic things with food, exercise, diet, and sleep, and also having meaningful relationships. That's about all you need to be doing. Yeah. You can take it to extremes, but these are very simple things that a lot of people are unaware of that can have a massive, massive impact.
Right.
They just don't know.
And speaking of perverse incentives, there's we'll just take the sugar industry, for example, which is basically selling you poison cocaine.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
took me 6 months, almost 6 months of going off sugar before I was finally done with the craving. It was, worse than any
Wow.
drug craving. Absolutely
Yeah.
nuts. But now it's gone. And for whatever reason, the
Hmm.
gut bacteria or whatever, they don't demand it anymore.
Oh
So I'm
yeah.
cool. But
Yep.
that's I feel so much younger than I did 2 years ago before I stopped. It's
Hmm.
incredible how poisonous that is. I think
Yeah, I personally think that sugar and also a few other things, but we won't get into all of the health stuff. It's kind of like punching yourself in the face,
yeah,
except it feels good on impact. It's just
right,
afterwards you end up a bit sore.
right.
I personally cannot relate to the mindset of people who look to food as a form of comfort or emotional support or pleasure. I understand, right?
Yeah,
Food can bring those feelings, but if you have to pay a massive price as a result of that in terms of your energy, your mood, cognition, your gut health, your digestion, anything like that,
right.
I just think why not find sources of food that you still enjoy, like that aren't like slapping yourself in the face and find joy and pleasure elsewhere. Like that to me seems pretty logical. But I'm sure that people have their reasons. I just can't relate to that. When I mentioned, I think on X, when you talked about sugar, I haven't had sugar for well in excess of a decade. I think we're closing on about 15 years. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah,
And this was a very obvious thing to stop consuming when I looked at the data and I'm like, you'd have to be dumb to like, why would I do this? It's
right.
voluntary to eat. Why would I keep slapping myself in the face in terms of health, cognition, mood when I don't need to?
Yeah,
And so,
I think it just comes down to addiction. I mean, it's not a rational choice at that point. And every time you go to, it's amazing where sugar hides because I now obsessively read
oh,
ingredients of
yeah.
everything I buy, and it's like
Ah,
it's in there.
yes.
High fructose
Well,
corn syrup.
that's
It's like yeah,
this is something that I think I had an early start on that. I did a lot of, you'd never know looking at me, but I did a lot of weight training in my early 20s. And I
yeah,
was very, very focused on understanding the metrics. Oh, imagine that. Autistic guy likes numbers. And so I got very, very, very familiar with the proportions of protein, carbohydrates, complex, simple fats in different products. I used to have challenges with friends where I'd bet them if I was within about 10% of the calories in a certain thing,
wow,
I'd get a bit of food. I was really good at that because I had a broad enough understanding of what's going into things. And if you are not reading what's in your food and understanding the nutritional sort of breakdown of, you are fucking up. I mean, you're really missing a trick. It's very important to understand because if you don't know what you're putting into your body, you literally don't know. People
yeah,
have this assumption, for example, that if they eat low fat products, this is good for them. This is absolute BS. The vast majority of low fat products, if you remove fat, there's only two other things that can fill its place: carbohydrates or protein. And your low fat, source is not full of extra protein. So
right,
it ends up with a bunch of extra sugar. And so people get the other thing I think people don't appreciate is the food industry is acting in its own interest. So, the grain industry, the sugar industry, you name it, they act in their own interest. They fund a lot of studies, and magically the results just happen to conveniently support. The food pyramid's almost entirely upside down.
right,
And the whole thing's basically a giant scam. And I think people would be well advised to take matters into their own hands and, like you, actually start reading these labels and understand because sugar is hidden everywhere. So is
yeah,
seed oils and a bunch of soy products that don't need to be there. And a lot of this, I mean, none of this is because it's nutritious or good for you. It's because it's cheap, economical. It's like, what can we do with this garbage that we're producing anyway? Oh, well, if we replace this nutritious, excellent with this, people still like the taste of it. It's cheaper for us. Hey, let's do that. This is what happens. It's not necessarily the fault of these food producers. They're doing this from a business point of view. But yeah, if you don't take control of your health, your nutrition, and understand what you're eating, you're really making a mistake.
right. And I think that's important. So I'm this was a cool rabbit hole. I'm going to try to cycle this back again because we're also talking about demographic collapse in a lot of parts of the world right now.
Mm.
And there's a piece of that that has to do with health because if people live longer, then of course you don't need to have as many children. And
Yep.
especially if we can reverse
Yep.
aging because then women can have babies longer in life, so they can have
Hmm.
children spread out more. Um,
Hmm.
but in addition to that, I started to think about humanoid bots as a potential like replacement for that demographic collapse. It's like we might not need as many as 8 billion plus human beings on the planet if we have 80 billion or 100 billion robots helping to do the work, especially if they're really smart, right? Not just doing
Mm.
manual labor, but also helping with the thinking process and advancing technology and everything. So I
Yeah.
don't know.
I
Maybe
think
that
that's
is
probable,
humanity 2.0.
but
Yeah,
I don't know if that's the ideal scenario. I think
I know.
personally, I would like to see the maximum number of humans as well. But I
Right,
do think that, I mean, we are going to have a huge population implosion. That's inevitable at this point.
right.
And I think humanoid robots are probably going to almost dig us out of that hole, because it's pretty simple math. If the population's aging, you have a bunch of old people. What are all the new people doing? The younger folks, well, they're looking after the old people. That's not really a thriving civilization.
Right.
But if there's humanoid robots that can help out in that regard, could be a different story. But yeah, I definitely agree with Elon on this point that the population alarmists are just, they're so anti-human, and it's completely unnecessary. I talked to a lot of people today around my age who've bought into the BS that, you know, the Earth can't sustain more people and it's overpopulated as it is, and more people will, you know, warm the climate. And then I think also culture's selling women a lie at the moment. The most modern women today, not all, but the majority, probably 80+%, will be fulfilled and satisfied in life if they've raised a wonderful family. But
Right.
most are being sold a lie that you have to go through school, have to go through university, have to get a degree, have to climb the corporate ladder. And usually somewhere around age 30, when the alarm bells are starting to tick via the biological clocks, like panic mode. I realized I wanted a family. What am I doing with my life?
Right.
And then looking around to date a guy, and suddenly the guys that were interested in their 20s not so interested anymore,
Yeah.
because there's beautiful 22-year-olds around and not,
Right.
you know. So suddenly these women are faced with the choice, panic, alarm bells. The guys I'm interested in aren't particularly interested in me. What do I do? Either I won't have kids, or I'll just pick a guy, date 3 guys. All right, he'll do. Bam. And then ends up with a lot of very ordinary, I think, relationships. So
Yeah.
this is an important issue I think is worth talking about as well, because
Yeah.
women in general are being sold a lie that it doesn't, until they get to a point where the biological clock's really ticking and the alarm bells are going off. A lot of women haven't realized, wait a minute, I've only got a few years to actually find a guy, date seriously, settle down
Right.
and have my family. And it becomes exponentially more difficult to have kids. So we have that happening at the same time, that people, in terms of the mindset, are just like, I don't want to have kids, blah, blah, blah. So guys definitely have it much easier in that regard. We can have children decades longer
Right.
than women at this point in time.
Yeah.
So we have a lot longer to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. My grandfather was born when his dad was 72. So, it's like,
Wow.
yeah, so you
That's
can,
incredible. Yeah.
yeah, guys can keep going for a long time if they want. So,
Yeah.
but it's really problematic. You see pretty much every. I was actually talking to someone from Al Jazeera this morning. He wanted to interview me, so I was talking to him, and I was like, "Oh, I don't know how to say this politically correctly." And he's like, "There is no way to say it." But basically, developing countries versus developed countries. Most of the children being born right now are in not Western, not fully developed countries, because
Yeah.
there's an obvious correlation, whatever the causation is, there's an obvious correlation. You hit developed country status and the birth rate just goes whoop, off. I think
Yep.
women, again, because they're being pushed to be in careers, it's more expensive
Hmm.
to live, so it's more expensive to have
Yep.
children. You have
Yep.
birth control, you have access to birth control, so you can choose not to have children. No
Hmm.
more of those, oopsie, made a mistake, and like, we got a kid now.
Yep. Yep.
All of those things really affect the birth rate, and
Oh, they do.
yeah, and
I think
mathematically,
there's
there's no way
another
to avoid
another
this right
layer as
now.
well.
Yeah,
I think in a lot of the developing nations also, there is a mindset of, well, some of our kids aren't going to make it, so let's have a
right,
few more than we would want or
right,
need, just to sort of hedge our bets. Whereas you'd be lucky in a sort of more developed nation now, you'd be lucky if a family's thinking of having 2 children,
right,
which is below replacement rate anyway, because there will be deaths along the way. Not everyone's going to make it to adulthood.
right.
And that seems to be a pretty clear correlation. And this is why I think the alarm bell should be sounding for population collapse, because as developing nations develop, suddenly the birth rates, where there's still 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 children per woman in some regions, collapses. It's going to get to 2. And then everywhere on earth is going to be far below replacement rate.
Yeah. And you can see countries that are not high on immigration. The United States, regardless of how it's happening, there's a lot of immigration coming in, probably not
Oh,
in the
yeah.
best way possible right at the moment. And actually, I want to talk to you about
Yeah.
moving to Austin potentially.
Please.
But
Mm.
but the countries that are very closed off, China, Korea, a lot of them tend to be in the Far East for whatever reason, but they tend to be like, no, we don't want anybody immigrating. Those countries are
Hmm.
in big trouble all of a sudden because people are not immigrating and they don't have a
Yep.
replacement population. And suddenly
Hmm.
and I would say Russia too. They've got that issue because people don't really want to move to Russia, so it's not a huge
Yep.
immigration destination. So Yeah, and I don't know what Australia in particular is, but I've heard your immigration policy is actually pretty reasonable, right?
Actually, we have an excellent immigration policy.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
essence, if you're skilled, useful, and in line with Australian values, welcome. I think
right.
that is a policy that every country should adopt.
Yeah,
And I mean, it's simple. Now, we do have an advantage. We're a gigantic isolated island, so it's a
right,
lot more difficult for illegal immigration versus somewhere like the United States with an extremely secure southern border, which is
right.
where, I mean, where you can just pay the cartel $10,000 and just wander over and then get told to show up at court 3 years from now and make sure you show up.
Right.
Don't disappear and never be seen from again. That would be really
Right.
bad.
Terrible.
So we have
Yeah,
an advantage because there would probably be a lot more illegal immigration into Australia were it easier, but we're surrounded by ocean, so it's kind of difficult to get here illegally. But we
yeah,
do have a very, very reasonable immigration policy for legal immigration, and it's great. We have an extremely flourishing multicultural society, and we have excellent economic opportunities. Not quite the same as the US, but Australia is a very desirable place to live. The cost of living is pretty high, but
yeah.
it's a great place overall, and you can understand why a lot of people would like to come here legally.
Right. And interestingly enough, a lot of the country is very, very empty. I watched a whole video on it
Oh yeah,
recently, and I was just like, "Holy crap! The middle of the country is just dead empty. There's like one person per
yeah.
like 10 kilometers or something. It's nuts."
Yeah, probably even less than that.
Yeah,
It's extremely inhospitable in the center of Australia. Basically, except for a few regions around the coast, it's pretty tough going. And it's quite interesting if any viewers want to do this while they're watching or after. If you search for a non-distorted map of Australia and then just have other countries overlaid, whether it's United States and different states or different continents,
right.
you'll be stunned how massive Australia is.
Yeah,
Absolutely enormous. And our population is extremely heavily concentrated just around the outsides on the east and west coast, basically.
right. Yeah, it's close to the size of the lower 48 United States, I think. It's not
Yeah,
that much less size. I
that's
mean,
right.
it's a
Yeah,
huge country. And
yeah.
yeah, but this was another thing that's I'm going to get to the Austin thing in just a sec, but it was making me think about, I'm sure when people heard 80 billion bots, they were like, "Hell no, where are they going to live?" But when you start thinking about even in the United States,
Mm.
which seems relatively populous on the coasts, when you get in the middle part in Kansas, Nebraska, and everything, there's not that many people there. Then you've got an entire continent like Australia that's just empty. It's like we
Yeah,
could throw a lot of bots
yeah.
in there that could be doing a lot of work with solar power because they don't need food, they don't need water.
Hmm.
All the
Yep.
things that humans need, us meat bags, we're pretty pathetic in terms of that kind of stuff. But bots could work
Yeah.
there easily.
Yeah, yeah. There's a great graphic I've seen online, a short video that shows all humans on Earth in a cube just dropped onto New York City. Like if every single human on the entire planet were in a cube, I think 1 mile by 1 mile or
Jeez.
something like that, right? They just drop it on New York and you're like, that's every single human on the entire planet fitting into, I think it basically just covers Manhattan, right? So it just goes to show how sparsely populated the majority of the planet is. But
Right,
just most people live in big cities, so we have a huge bias because what we see is a lot of people around us, but
right.
that's not representative of the average, square kilometer or square mile on Earth. Not even close.
So
There's a
yeah,
lot
I
of
think
space.
for people, if eventually, originally, of course, these bots are going to be a little bit not robust enough to handle this kind of stuff, and they'll work in cities and factories and things close to humans. But eventually, especially as they're getting trained up to go off planet and stuff, you've
Hmm.
got the Sahara Desert, you've got the gigantic outback in Australia, you've got the polar regions. I mean, there's lots of
Hmm.
places that are very inhospitable to humans where these bots could, weirdly enough, have their own societies and essentially live outside human
Yeah,
control, which is bizarre to think about. But if they're that smart, why not? So,
indeed.
wow. What are they doing when we're not watching? Austin, I know you've been talking about that for a while, and I assume that's where you still want to
Mm.
go. Like, so why move to
Yeah,
the US? The US has got, significant problems. Why is it
yeah,
appealing to
yeah.
come here?
Look, the US is not perfect, but it's been calling me for a number of years. I actually
Okay.
found an old file, and there's probably files older than this, but on the cloud that was dated in 2014, where I had moved to Austin. And
Oh,
the
okay.
reason for that, it's a long story, but I'd been over for an Airbnb event and met some people and got chatting. And one of the women I was speaking to is like, "Bro, you belong in Austin." I'm like, "Interesting." So I looked into it. I'm like, you know what? There might be something to this. It's basically just for opportunity, business reasons for the channel. It makes sense to be closer to Tesla, to Tesla's headquarters, to be able to meet up and collaborate with a lot of creators. It's a lot more difficult now in terms of time zones to do Skypes, Zooms, these kind of things. So
I can't
there's a lot of
imagine that. What?
mission focused reasons to do so. It just makes a lot of sense. And I did visit Austin in 2021, do some recon, and
Right.
it's the place for me. Yeah, I fell in love with the people, the town, the culture. Everyone's so friendly, warm, inviting. By the way, shout out to my Austin friends. I miss you guys. And so, a quick update on that as well. The wheels are turning. There's been a few false starts getting across. I mean, it would be a lot easier just to pay the cartel and walk through the southern border, but I want to come legally. But all things being equal, unless I get a massive rejection, hopefully you should be living in Austin within a year.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, that's cool. I'll I go there from time to time, so we'll certainly hook up and get a beer or something like
Yeah.
that when we when that happens. But that's really exciting to find out. So yeah, let me ask you about this now. What is life going to look like in 2030? Like put on take off this hat, put on the other hat. What does your
Yeah,
prognosticator
it's a
hat
tough
say?
one.
Just generally, not just Tesla, but everything.
I actually think this is going to be a difficult answer to process for some people, but it's going to be very similar and very different at the same time. I think basically the way I kind of think about civilization now, we're basically a bunch of monkeys that have not long descended from the trees. Yeah, we're driving vehicles around, using computers, talking to each other digitally or telepathically, via video. And so there's an interesting sort of mishmash of new and old. And I think that we're going to enter a sort of new version of that where there'll be some absolutely mind blowing technology that looks like absolute magic. We may be on the cusp of having AGI. It may be there. Hard to know exactly. But at the same time, I think there's still going to be a lot of similarities to today. People are going to enjoy spending time with family, friends, in company, eating a good meal. There could be huge disruption to real estate depending on where things go with virtual reality and telecommuting and these kind of things. But I also think for some strength, it's just gut feel. My gut feel, because I've thought about this a lot. I think that rare pieces of land and prime real estate will retain value, even though if we live in a virtual reality world, it's totally illogical that would make sense. Because why not people just spread out and it'd be more affordable to live here and there? So I think this is what I mean when there's just going to be a weird mishmash of new and old. I think that people are still going to be working in general. Most people will still be working, but I think we are going to start to see a crisis of meaning and purpose where AI and robots are replacing so many jobs, especially the people who don't necessarily. There's kind of different layers. You've got a job, you've got a career, and you've got a mission. I think the people who are in jobs are going to be displaced quite quickly. People in careers, it's going to sort of be next, and those with missions are probably the last. But I do think there's going to be a bit of a crisis of purpose where millions, hundreds of millions of people are being displaced and not sure what to do with themselves. And hashtag misogynist, I think guys are going to struggle a lot more with this because women, they have a purpose, 90%, 80%, have a beautiful family. You've ticked your major goal in life. You'll be very satisfied with that. Now, not all women, but most guys, that's not true. Family, important. Mission, the most important. Guys who, generally speaking, don't have a mission to focus on, they spiral into depression, addiction. And so I think that this is really heavily disproportionately going to affect men who get displaced and suddenly they lose their sense of purpose and mission. And I think this is actually going to become a major issue that we deal with by 2030 and beyond, because there's going to be displacement of hundreds of millions of guys who previously had this huge box tick, a fundamental core aspect of their identity, who they are, suddenly gone. And now what? And especially those guys who've thrown themselves entirely into their career, their profession, they don't have other interests or hobbies. What are they going to do? Where do they even start? I think this is going to be a major challenge.
Yeah,
So
I can definitely see that. I hadn't thought about the male female divide in terms of that, but I think you're right, because I think if you asked most men, like say 25 or older, like after university and all that kind of stuff, and you're like, okay, who are you? They'll probably tell you their job first, even if they're married and have
of
kids.
course,
They'll
of
be like,
course,
I
yep,
work
I
I
do
work for
this.
GM, or
Yep.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And women, I don't know that that's the same answer. I think if they're married and have kids, they'll probably be like, oh, I'm a mom. I've got two beautiful kids
Yeah.
and I work at this place. So yeah.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, I think that this is a major distinction between the psychology of men and women. As I said, I mean, people get so mad when I point this out, but the vast majority of women are born with a clear purpose, have a great family, be a great mum,
yeah.
done. And most women, again, not everybody, but, and it's funny because the most disagreeable women happen to be the most masculine women who literally don't align with this norm are the ones that get really mad. Don't worry, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the women who aren't going to rage at somebody who had a different opinion, but a lot more agreeable. Most women, 80+% of women, if they have a family, they have achieved their life's mission and they feel incredibly satisfied. If you ask older in life, you know, how did you feel about life? Is there any major regrets? They'll say, I had a wonderful family, had a great time. I really feel fulfilled and satisfied. Whereas it's very rare to find a guy who their family was their purpose and
Right.
didn't need to have something that they were driving towards, a mission. It's just, it's built into us. And like a lot of people don't like to accept that there's major differences in what drives men and women and what will bring us satisfaction. But, this is something that I think a lot of people don't like to talk about either, because everyone gets triggered and mad. You're a sexist, you're a misogynist. But these are just biological facts. And it's only the programming in the last 10 or 15 years that's kind of been brainwashing society into thinking this is not true. Like the vast majority of women who are portrayed in Hollywood film everywhere in the last 15, 20 years, every single man, maybe one exception, is a moron. And the wife is his mummy. She's driving the ship. He's incompetent. He needs her. She's making the decisions. She's got him on a leash. He's useless. She basically just has to do everything for him because he's a moron.
Right.
And so people are being brainwashed into thinking that things are very other than they actually are. And I talk to a lot of women that I date, and I ask questions about, their career versus family. And if you dig deep enough, you find a lot of these women really want nothing more than to have a family. But many of them are currently climbing the corporate ladder. And I'm like, you do realize that by the time you start looking for a guy, it's going to be harder to find somebody. And like, well, and eventually you get to the core of it, and most women will go, you know what, that's actually a fair point. Right. And they're sort of being sold a lie here, because people, it's an uncomfortable thing to say. Men and women are different. Imagine that. But it's very true.
It's pretty crazy, because that was really not the case when I was younger. It's just, it's something that's generated relatively recently. And
yes,
I certainly don't want to, I think what you're saying is statistically we're talking about this, because there are always people who don't fit these norms, and that's perfectly fine. The world is obviously full of many different people. And so I want to be clear, it's not like any kind of disparagement for any people who feel differently, but I think you're absolutely right. I mean, biologically, as a species, we're not going to continue. We would not exist today if these were not true facts, because we wouldn't have been a successful species. We got to want to have, you got to really want to have sex. And then one of the two, the male or female, has got to want to raise kids, because these kids are useless for the first 5 or so years. Like,
that's right. Yeah.
Think for themselves. So
I think we typically, as a species, we need a protector provider and a nurturer. And when we're talking about the distinction between men and women, just to be really clear, what we're really talking about is the distinction between masculine and feminine. And these aren't aesthetic traits. A lot of people have this idea when they hear masculine in their head of like some big tough guy who's hairy, he's an ogre, he'll beat you up. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about traits: decisive, leader, in control, makes decisions, protects, provides. That's what we're talking about, that nature, versus the feminine, which is more nurturing, caring, loving. And so this is what we're talking about. And there are some men who are much more feminine. They have that nurturing nature. And these are great stay-at-home dads. These are the rare guys you'll see working often as teachers in primary schools or in daycares, nurseries, right? Even in airlines, and as opposed to typically, and even in nursing as well. Right. And there are some women who are much more masculine, who are out here conquering the world, climbing the corporate ladder, building businesses. And this is totally fine. It's not a judgment, but it's just the ratios of men who are mostly feminine versus women who are mostly masculine. They're the vast minority.
Right.
And the interesting point is that typically the masculine is much louder with its voice and opinion. And so you find that there's a disproportionate number of women who are representing the minority, who are quite masculine, who are screaming from the rooftops that all women are the same as them, and therefore smash the patriarchy, this, that, and the other, not realizing that their voices are disproportionately representing an actually very small sort of percentage of overall women. But there's no right or wrong here, of course, but it is important to recognize that we have these natures. Most men are predominantly masculine and most women are predominantly feminine. Not always the case, but that's what we're really talking about here. The nurturing side being feminine and the protective provider being the masculine. Sometimes that's a woman being masculine, sometimes a man being feminine, but usually not.
Right. So I'm going to go back to like what you talked about. The world is going to be the same, but different. I'm reminded, and I think it was 2003 when Minority Report came out, the Tom Cruise and Steven Spielberg movie. And one of the things that really struck me back then was that there was a real intentionality to try to make Washington, D.C. area look relatively the same as it did in 2003, with changes like those weird cars driving down highways and the retinal scans. And at the time I was like, oh, retinal scans, that's so funny. That's science fiction. Now it's like, oh, damn, they have these things. The Apple Vision Pro does this little like, when you look at it, and it's got the retinal scan. So it feels weird. And also it's very much like Minority Report, where you can do that thing with your hands and move windows around and everything. So, but I like that idea that it's not like suddenly all the architecture is going to change, because they're big buildings and nobody's going to like tear them
Yep.
down and build up new ones right away.
Yep.
So it's, and of course, culturally, we're still apes. So we're still going to
Yeah.
relate to each other basically the same way. So a lot of that stuff is
Hmm.
by de facto just going to have to remain the same. It's just going to be this substrate of AI and compute technology, which has been growing. I mean, even before AI, like the last, I don't know, gosh, what was I watching? I was watching a movie that was from the, like, oh, it was actually X-Files. So it was a TV show from like 1993, 1994, and they were having to go through papers. They had to go get file cabinets out and look through. And I was like,
Hmm.
holy crap, that's 30 years ago, but it's just like
Yep.
unbelievable. So you just go and Google it, man. It's just
Yep.
crazy.
It's always funny seeing something historically and seeing how different stuff was done, and then thinking about how much time was just vaporized. You
Yeah,
think about how much time was expended having to actually go and physically get the paper
right.
versus now, just look it up online. And that
Yeah,
goes back to the comments about increasing productivity. We
yeah,
find ways to use that increasing productivity. The amount of stuff that we get done relative to even just a decade or two ago is just astonishing. Yet we're all still busy as ever. We
yeah.
find ways to use that.
That is true. Mission
Yeah.
driven, baby. I think I always think about YouTube that way too. I'm like, if you had dialed the clock back to 2000 or even 2005 or something, we could not do what we were doing. The best we could have done would be those local cable access TV stations where they would give
Hmm.
you access and 100 people would watch you at midnight or something
Yeah.
like that. This
Yeah.
platform, it couldn't, we've immortized the incredible technological capabilities across billions of people. So it doesn't cost us basically a penny to start out. You take your phone,
Oh,
you
it's
look at your
incredible.
phone. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, when I first started this YouTube channel, I didn't even have a camera. I had a really bad smartphone. I actually had to build a blanket fortress and yell into the phone because I was in a really echoey apartment.
I
And
remember
the
those
second video
videos.
ever, yeah, it's funny, but my voice sounds really different. I didn't realize, but when you like lean down like this, your voice gets really, it sounds very, very different. And I was reading a script off one phone and yelling into the other phone to try and drown out the background noise. It's so bad. But even then, with just an absolute, not even potato quality video, I didn't even have video
Right.
and terrible audio on a really cheap phone. I was still able to reach a very large audience and sort of find my tribe. That would not have been possible just a couple of decades ago, but it's phenomenal now. And
Yeah.
we really do live in the greatest ever time to be alive, especially in terms of opportunity.
Right.
Because anyone, anywhere, if they have internet access, they're set.
Yep.
You can learn. If you can learn, then you can gain knowledge. And suddenly you're useful. And suddenly you can reach people at scale. It's incredible. There's so much opportunity, I think, that people don't appreciate. To do what I've done
Go ahead.
in 20 years ago would not have been possible for me because I would have had to play the game and be, a sociopath to sort of be not who I was just to get in media, to appear on television, be total fraud, not be my genuine self, just to reach an audience. And then the content I was talking about, it wouldn't be this because no one would be interested at a large enough scale locally that it would make economic sense.
Right. Right. I was just going to mention the fact that we've got, Musk's, another of his companies, which is SpaceX and Starlink, is radically expanding that opportunity to people who really did not have a chance to be connected at decent speeds
Oh,
to the
yeah.
internet before. That is a huge,
Yeah.
and that really helps, that's a rising tide that lifts all boats, I think. It's great
Yeah.
that some
Oh, I agree.
person, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Access to information allows people to lift themselves out of poverty, in essence.
yeah,
I spent some time in Peru a while ago, and I was in mountain villages and in the jungle where, if you were lucky, there was an internet link that was down most of the time. That was like 1 trillionth of a kilobyte per second up and down, just absolute trash. And I just kept thinking, man, if only these kids had access to YouTube or Khan Academy and
oh
could
yeah,
learn, and these communities could learn new techniques and technologies for housing, infrastructure, it would just be so phenomenal. And now, a few years later, Starlink makes this actually possible.
yeah,
And so you really don't appreciate until you've been to a very isolated area that doesn't have internet. The mountain villages that I was in Peru had no internet, no phone reception, nada. And the toughest places on earth to live are mountains. It's very hard to get stuff in and out. So these people really, really struggle. And if you're farming in a mountain village, you're farming on like these almost sheer vertical. It's just so hard to do basic stuff. But suddenly, if people have access to information, it can really sort of level the playing field. And
right.
I think this is going to be phenomenal. Roughly half the people on Earth today aren't online, just really roughly.
Yeah.
Imagine when they are. What's happened to the half of humanity that has become online?
Right. Yeah, going back and speaking of 125 years ago, we made a lot of progress with people, and a lot of that is communication and the foundations of knowledge that build up generation to generation. But if you don't have access to that, you have to go back and reinvent everything if you're, that
Yep.
person who's isolated in a mountain village. But if once you have access to that, you don't have to reinvent it, and you can build off of whatever. Who knows it?
Yep.
The next Albert Einstein could be in the mountains of Nepal or Peru or something like that. And having access to the internet would allow him or her to like make these amazing breakthroughs that would never have happened previously because they simply wouldn't have had access
Yep.
to the information to learn how to do that. So that's an amazing
100%.
and very, it's a touching thing to think about. It really makes me happy. And I hope the SpaceX team is very happy about that, because it's quite the mission to be on. Speaking of missions. Okay, so I've kept you for a while. I want to ask you one last question, because we've been talking about the future. What is Tesla in 2030? Like what is what are they producing? What is their value? Oh, screw their valuation. Who cares? They're going to be worth a lot more than they are today. But like, what are they going to be doing?
Probably a pretty good bet.
Yeah.
I think realistically, Tesla's going to be operating a very large scale robotaxi network. They'll still be pumping out as many vehicles as they can per year. I think the humanoid robot will be scaling pretty rapidly as well. And I think that people on Wall Street might finally understand that Tesla's a little bit more than just a car company at that point. And
it's going to take 6 more years. Damn.
Hard to know for sure. I think realistically there is going to be a pretty long lag in terms of perceptions. It just seems to be people very slow moving in Wall Street to see change that's happening. Much with Apple and the smartphone and the ecosystem that was built on that. It took a very long time for people widely on Wall Street to really understand what was happening. I think when Tesla starts rolling out robo-taxis, the first place is going to be somewhere in California. They'll get approval. They'll do a few rides. And the end will be like, oh, who cares? That was like 3 robo-taxi rides. And the models will be like 2030. Tesla's going to have 50,000 robo-taxis on Earth. And the actual number's probably going to be order of magnitude plus beyond that. And so I think that there's still going to be a lot of misunderstanding of the true scale, but it's going to be quite obvious that Tesla has solved autonomy, that the humanoid robot's going to be an important deal. But it's hard to know exactly what things look like then. But my best guesses are autonomy solved, robotaxis are widely deployed, and the humanoid robot's doing useful labor, being produced at scale and being sold to customers en masse. And depending on where AGI is, are we there? Are we close? Are we approaching? Things could get pretty ridiculous. So when we get to the point where the robots can make more robots, all bets are off. So, and I'll probably be talking about that point coming up in 2030 if we're not already there.
There we go. And we can clip these old videos and be like, hey, see, we talked about this.
Well, that's part of my strategy. I've been very explicit in saying things, planning always from day one on this channel to send an AI in the future through my transcripts to clip. This is why I speak in hyperbole and absolutes, just to make sure there was no doubt that I was confident in what I said. Because it doesn't quite have the same impact getting a clip going, I think it's possible that maybe this... much more impact to go, listen, bitches, this is going to happen.
You're the anti Wall Street guy.
Literally. I think that's actually honestly a bit of a reaction to Wall Street. I'm overdoing that on purpose a little bit because of the pussification of Wall Street.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think that's great. And we'll just go, we'll go with that. So do you predict any new, is there like one more thing that Tesla's going to do by 2030 that we don't know about yet? Like not just another car, right? It's like, okay, they have a different model car or something, but is there anything else to do, or is this enough what they're doing right now?
I actually had this conversation with a friend just a few nights ago, and my answer was, it's possible, but I can't really see beyond the bot. I mean, there's obviously going to be things. I mean, HVAC's at some point going to happen as well, but in terms of like a major product, and maybe we'll get the VTOL as well, it's really hard to see. But when I first started buying Tesla stock in 2016, I wasn't thinking autonomy, right? And a few years ago, I wasn't thinking humanoid robot. I mean, very few people were, except James Dowmer. Shout out, by the way, to him actually calling that was a likely thing to happen. What an absolute genius in the most literal sense. And so it's definitely possible there'll be something that I don't see coming, but my brain's nowhere near big enough to see it. Nowhere near. So my best guess is I don't have one. I've got no idea. But I mean, it's hard to imagine something that has more impact than a humanoid robot.
Right.
That's intelligent. It's really hard. I mean, that's basically humans are the most productive and incredible species on Earth by far. And it's like human version 2.0. What's bigger than that?
Right.
Because everything that we've done so far as a species, a civilization, is a subset of humans. Like it's something that we created, we did. So if you have intelligent, useful humanoid robots that eventually match and then exceed human intelligence,
Right.
then it's hard to imagine what comes as a result of that. I mean, could there be a technology as revolutionary as the internet? Of course, but I can't even imagine it. My brain's nowhere near big enough.
Right. Gosh. Well, the only thing I can think of is that we'll be heading towards some sort of neural link connection with bots or something like that, where
Yeah.
we'll be able to interact with them more efficiently. I don't know if that turns us into the Borg, speaking of Star Trek, but
Yeah, resistance is futile.
well, yeah,
I,
we'll be that mile by mile cube flying through space with
yeah,
all the humans on
yeah,
it. So.
that's right. Assimilating knowledge, not our beings. But yeah, I actually have thought about that, and I think there's likely to be somewhat of a convergence between many of the Musk companies, including Neuralink interface, humanoid robots, AGI. I think that Tesla and or XAI are going to form some sort of LLM. I think that what's happening now with the XAI company is they're going to probably license Tesla's brain for FSD, the vision component for intelligence. And Tesla's probably going to license the language component that'll be developed. And suddenly you've got the two pieces of the puzzle for useful humanoid robots that can actually do things in the real world, not just move, but also communicate. And I think inevitably, if Neuralink's also in the picture over a long enough period of time, there's going to be some form of interfacing between, because Musk has talked for a long time about the importance of interfacing and being part of, as opposed to separate from artificial general intelligence, just for the safety alignment. And so that does seem inevitable over a long enough time frame. But yeah, I would still consider Neuralink a separate company now, but it does seem over a long enough time frame, there's got to be an integration with Neuralink into Tesla's humanoid robots / their whatever vessel carries their AGI.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I personally would prefer to have my age reversed and be able to stay alive in this body, but there is an advantage to being in a robot body because it's quite easily transferable from one to another. So speaking of eternal life, that gives you pretty much close to infinite life. And I would also love to go see Europa or Alpha Centauri or something like that. So put myself in there.
You're speaking my language, man.
I know, just turn it off until you're there and then wake back up again. And it's an instantaneous trip as far as you're concerned. That would be pretty cool. So yeah,
I'll be all for it. I'll be all for it.
What a future this is going to be. Here's hoping. Let's make it that way. All right. Thank you so much, Stephen. This has been a fantastic chat. And I know I've kept you for a little over an hour at this point, but I could keep talking forever. We're going to get a beer sometime and I'll come on your channel if you ever have any interest in, not that I care about much about Tesla stock, but I would love to come.
I'll have you in person when I'm over in the US. We'll do an in-person sit down.
Yeah. There we go.
Have some barbecue in Austin and a chat.
There we go. All right. In the meantime, everybody, make sure you follow Stephen on his channel. I'll put that link in the description in case you don't know. You've been living under a rock for the last 15 years or something. And everybody have a great day, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.
Cool. Great to be here. Thanks, man.